This next session brings together national perspectives on cultural planning and the role of arts in cities. What lessons have been learned across the United States that could help advance the art form of dance and New York City as a dance capital? What are the opportunities for local and national dialogue for action? Please join me in welcoming our wonderful moderator, Jamie Bennett, Executive Director of ArtPlace America.
Excellent, thank you so much. In my gig at ArtPlace, I sort of travel the country and chair panels and attend conferences, and pretty much every time I introduce one, I say that it is my favorite panel of the season that I'm looking forward to. In this case, I mean it. I think when Lane and... I do always say it, that is true, but this time I actually do mean it. At least once a year, I'm telling the truth. But I don't know, 6 months ago, 4 months ago now, Lane said, who are some of the best minds that we could think of who could share experiences on cultural planning, who could talk about the role of art in cities? And I think we said, I don't know, a dream team would be something like Sansan, Michelle, and Eddie. And we got 100% acceptance. So I'm really excited to be joining them in this conversation with all of you guys. So just to sort of begin, at the far end is my colleague Sansan Wong, who's Senior Program Officer at the Barr Foundation in Boston, which is partnering with the City of Boston on a cultural planning process. And full disclosure, I work for an organization that receives funding from Barr. Closest to me is Eddie Torres, our Deputy Commissioner for Cultural Affairs here in New York City. And Eddie used to give my organization money when he was at Rockefeller. And in the middle is Michelle Boone, who's done nothing for me. I think it's very sad. So bios, you know, these guys are all well known. Their bios are in the books, their bios are online. But just by way of introducing yourselves, can you each just think for a moment about a specific piece of dance or a specific moment of dancing or the last time you danced that was especially special? And just let's just ground this in a moment of that. Eddie, can we start with you and we'll just run down?
Sure. For me, it's hard to decide any one thing, but one thing that comes to mind, and I don't see Simon Dove here, but I mean, the work that Casita Maria and Dancing in the Streets have been doing in the South Bronx, I've really been moved by. I'm somewhat biased coming from the South Bronx, and like Susana Laval, who made this remark earlier, I'm also Puerto Rican, and it's just a big part of our sort of cultural tradition. But to see non-professional dancers and professional dancers mixed like that in public space, affirming the role of communities of color in the development of dance, it just really moved me a lot.
That's awesome. Michelle, last great moment of dance, a great moment of dance?
Does my niece's dance recital count?
It absolutely does. What did she dance?
Well, I don't know what she did, but it was a lot of twirling and taffeta involved. And she was quite adorable. I could name, I don't know, 100 different dances that have kind of moved me personally, but I'll speak to one instance professionally. I used to also be a program officer, and in that role, I didn't do anything for Jamie either. But we did support now defunct dance company, Luna Negra, and New York is now the beneficiary of Eduardo Valaro now being the head of Ballet Hispanico. But having a chance to see a choreographer bring his dream of a ballet company rooted in kind of the Latin dance styles, and to be a part of supporting that work, and then to see on stage the real beauty of it all being presented to wide, vast, diverse audiences was quite a thrill.
That's excellent. Sansan.
So last week I was out on Martha's Vineyard at the Yard, which is now being run by David White, who was the executive director of Dance Theater Workshop and one of the co-founders of National Performance Network. And the company that I saw was Le Peton Libre, which is a company based in Quebec. It's an ice dancing company. And the first half of the show, we were sitting in the bleachers behind a hockey puck net. And then on the second half of the show, we moved and we started sitting on the ice. And the kind of change in a lot of the change and challenges of what is dance and what's ice skating just really started hitting me while I was sitting on the ice, and just getting a sense of the perspectives, the momentum, the kind of different sense of gravity and movement. So it was pretty exciting. And I was sitting in back of some people who were wearing sweatshirts that said Vineyard Hockey Team. And so that kind of effort of just bringing ice dancing or bringing dancing into a rural community onto an ice arena where there's normally just hockey playing was just so exciting to me. I think the other part that was really exciting was the commitment to international presenting, and something that we know is really being challenged right now in terms of the current administration. The commitment to artists in terms of a creative development period and having them be able to develop work, but then also being able to work with year-round, low-income residents that are normally in a tourist, high-density tourist area. So super exciting company and great commitment.
Cool.
Can I just share one? I just remembered, I saw a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, Bathsheba, the Israeli dance company, was in Chicago. I have to say it was an amazing experience for me. I don't know if I really understood it as a dance piece, but the appreciation of the mastery and the skill and the athleticism, like, just had me captivated. And that was an incredible experience.
I think that's fantastic. All right, so let's sort of zoom up a little bit and think about this notion of cultural planning. And I worked at the National Endowment for the Arts for 3 years in a previous administration, and was in a lot of conversations about cultural policy. And when we talk about cultural policy in this country, many times what we really mean is we want more money for nonprofits and we don't want you to tell them what to do with it. Right? We all are doing great work. We love what we're doing. We want more money. We don't want anyone to tell us what to do. And in cultural planning and in cultural policy, we have to make choices, right? We have to look at the ecosystem. We have to think about, what do we have too much of? What do we have too little of? What needs incentive? What doesn't need incentive? It's going to happen anyway. So, Sansan, you've completed a planning process in Boston, and you're entering into an implementation process. The city is, and you guys are working with them. What were some of the difficult choices that happened along the way? What were some of the conversations about the decisions we had to make where it wasn't just more for everyone?
That's a really great question. I think that when Boston started its cultural planning process, we were at a really interesting moment because we had a new mayor, and we had a mayor for 20 years. And so we saw this as really kind of an opportunity to try and put arts on a platform. I think the difficult choice, some of the difficult choices were really about, were kind of political choices in some ways, in terms of when is it about the direct funding and increasing financial resources versus kind of beginning to put policy in place that might be longer term benefit. So I think that was one quick thing, like, how do you get the quick win around some money and some funding, but actually what you really want is the long-term systemic change in terms of departments valuing the arts and always wanting artists at the planning table. And so I think that was the really difficult one for us, is just like that offset of like the short-term win versus kind of the long-term policy that you're talking about.
Now, Michelle, Chicago completed its most recent cultural planning process how long ago now? 5 years?
2012.
2012, okay. And you've got both the perspective of a little bit of time and distance, and you're no longer in government. So you can speak honestly. When you look back and when you think about that planning process, what's one thing that you guys got really right, and what's one thing that you guys got really wrong?
I think the thing that we really got right was right from the start, we knew it had to be a really inclusive process. And so the plan had a very long public engagement, well, not as long as we probably needed, a long, intense public engagement process, that it wasn't about policymakers or myself or the mayor sitting together in a room saying, here's what I think the city needs for the arts, but really taking the time to go out into nearly every neighborhood in the city and ask residents and citizens and cultural workers, what is it that you want to see in the cultural plan? And as a result, we had a really comprehensive laundry list of ideas, but it was one that really reflected the spirit of the city and what was top of mind for people and really gave some focus for the work that the department was to do in terms of how to tackle some of those initiatives. So that part we got right. I think the thing that we could have done a better job about was being more thoughtful about the implementation of all of that work. That much like the situation in Boston, we also had the mandate to do a cultural plan with, as a part of a new administration. And this thirst for having a new plan. Chicago hadn't had a cultural plan in over 25 years, so people were anxious and ready for it. We were able, and people, got caught up in the momentum and the frenzy of it all, in the doing of the plan. And at the end, we realized, oh, wait a minute, nobody's thought about implementation. Where's the money gonna come from? So I had to call the mayor and say, we're about to release the plan, and there's no money. And 25 years ago, when Chicago did a cultural plan, the then mayor, Harold Washington, allocated $1 million for the implementation of the cultural plan. And people are gonna wanna know, what's Emmanuel gonna do? I'm just saying. And so he called back a couple of days later, and he's like, all right, I got your fucking $1 million. And I was like, oh, I should have asked for more. So, not being really, what I got wrong was not being more thoughtful and asking him for $5 million instead of $1 million for the implementation. But I think, too, we were so caught up in the frenzy of the doing of the plan that we really didn't take the time to think about the end strategy, which probably could have informed a lot of the work in the development of the plan.
That's awesome. Now, Eddie, you guys, the cultural plan is going to be delivered on July 1st. And very smartly, that's after the city's adopted its budget. So there isn't going to be this immediate need for what is Mayor de Blasio going to do in terms of money. You guys are going to have a year to sort of socialize it with the other agencies, with the citizens, to think about things before you even get into the budget conversation. So we'll assume that more money is more better. But if this were a year from now, if this were a year and a half from now, July 2018, and I was interviewing you about this unbelievably successful cultural planning process, what would you tell me would be the sort of 3 biggest successes as you sort of project ahead and think what you'd really love to see, besides funding, really big successes that you'd love to see come out of this?
Well, that's a great question. Ultimately, I think any plan, you kind of have a number of opportunities that are a part of it. So one is to actually plan, to say, we're going to do this differently, we're going to do that differently. Then you have the opportunity also to inform. So you're able to share with residents, what we do and what other parts of the city does to support culture. And I actually find information is one of the big through lines whenever we have public discussions. Just there is such a challenge interacting with government because of the perceived opacity of it and the sort of the feeling that this snarled bureaucracy. I have no entryway into this, but also to advocate, right? And so, as a member of the administration, officially speaking, I don't advocate. When the budget comes out, I stand there alongside the rest of the administration. But obviously, anyone who runs a public agency wants more resources for their issue area, So essential to our thinking is that this is a means by which to put in front of City Hall, the City Council, et cetera, the value proposition for arts and culture, to say that this is important and has been deemed important by more than just the people who work in the cultural community, but there is a broad cross-section. The vast majority of New Yorkers have identified this as an essential public utility, and to have secured greater resources, particularly in underinvested communities, peoples, et cetera.
That's great. One of the things in the sort of planning call we had for this, we talked about the fact that one of the real successes is exactly what you said, Eddie, that the outcome of a successful cultural planning process is that the arts and culture community does not see the Department of Cultural Affairs as its only advocate in city government. That when there are issues of housing and affordability, there is the Department of Housing and Preservation. When there are issues of healthcare, and there are very real issues of healthcare for the dance community, for the American community, from the New York community at the moment, we see the Department of Public Health and on and on. Sun, a lot of the work that you guys did in Boston was sort of creating those alliances, creating those opportunities to connect with other agencies. What are a couple of the ones that you're excited about?
I think the one I'm really excited about is Department of Neighborhood Services and Department of Neighborhood Development. And so one of the big challenges, like New York, is affordability and affordable housing and venues and facilities. And so we've been looking at the partnering with those different departments, the Department of Planning and Development, to look at the development of artist-specific spaces and policies around that. I think the other one that we're really interested in is in the, is probably just, I would say just more broadly, just trying to put artists into residence at City Hall and just having departments go through kind of a planning process to get artists in place. I think the other one I'm really excited about is artists working with the police department. And just, at least in Boston, this kind of idea that art can help create more empathy on the part of police. We've also had some discussions where choreographers are saying to police, you know, we can show you when to anticipate movement, and what does that movement mean? What does that signal to you? And how do you then use your body language to then diffuse the situation? So that's the one I'm really excited about that's close to dance.
Michelle, who were some of your closest colleagues in the city government outside the Department of Cultural Affairs when you were there? Who were some of the folks that you worked with?
When we went out and asked residents what is it that they wanted most out of the cultural plan, without fail, at every single meeting, the number one thing that people wanted was more arts education. And it wasn't just about arts in the schools, but actually access to lifelong learning in the arts. So I would say our strongest ally was with the Chicago Public School System. And that led to the development of an arts education plan, which in turn led to this partnership with artists across the board throughout the city to support arts education programs. And I reached out to a colleague at the Dance Service Organization to, get her feedback on what she thought the impact of the cultural plan was on the dance community specifically. And she said it led to like over 200 companies getting contracts to do work within the school. And so that's a huge windfall for choreographers and for dancers to actually have supplemental income. So CPS was one. The other big collaborator for the cultural plan was working with the Business Affairs and Consumer Protection. That department issues permits and licenses for spaces and venues. And navigating how to complete those applications can be really, really daunting, not just for artists, but for anybody. And to work closely with the staff in the Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Office to look at these applications through a different lens, that art spaces are not your typical bars or other kind of, applications that they would normally look at. And so we created a whole new toolkit that was originally designed to help the applicant, but it ended up being this learning opportunity for the people in the office about how to think about performance space in a different way, or when gallerists are applying for licenses or permits. So that's been a huge impact on the field.
Now, Eddie, you talked a little bit about sort of navigating city services and the need for that sort of concierge function. And so, particularly in the dance community, we have lots of folks that don't incorporate as 501c3s. They're either individual artists, sole proprietors, small businesses, LLCs. Outside the Department of Cultural Affairs, who are some of the folks that we should think about as sort of some of our first stops when we need things from city government? If I'm not a 501c3, if I'm a cultural producer in a different kind of business model.
I mean, this isn't within city government. This is the borough arts councils, and we've increased, our giving to the borough's arts councils this year, and I think that that's actually something that we're thinking very strategically about, especially when it comes to increasing supports to individual artists and also non-incorporated organizations, for two reasons. One is that obviously we simply want to give all of them more support, but also we want to increasingly give community agency to sort of selection processes and selection criteria so that those who know the folks on the ground are increasingly decision makers. But other than that, I mean, a lot of what we've been doing is bringing folks together to talk about these issues, and a lot of our engagement with individual artists, we've actually brought other agencies into those conversations because of exactly this issue. So the vast majority of folks who are dealing with art in public space, for instance, are actually dealing with Parks and Rec. They're dealing with Department of Transportation, or they're dealing with the street activities permitting offices, all of which are very, very foreign to most of us, So if we're sitting there alongside them and we're kind of brokering those dialogues, one of the things that we've come to find throughout this process is this form of public engagement has been fairly novel for us as an agency. And while we're happy to be doing this towards the end of writing this cultural plan, what we've come to recognize is that essential to our time post the writing of the cultural plan and through the execution is we have to keep doing this because, one, we're just learning so much from talking to people directly, and two, we find we're actually brokering conversations that we haven't been able to before, and that's fairly essential.
That's really interesting. Let me just do a quick sort of poll. Think about your sort of primary dance-making identity affiliation. In that role, how many folks have had contact with the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in the last 12 months? How many folks have had contact with your borough arts council, with one or more of the borough arts councils? In that role, how many of you have had contact with another city agency other than the Department of Cultural Affairs? Okay. It's interesting. I always find that an interesting sort of move. So let's, San, you talked about sort of neighborhood development when the commissioner was speaking this morning and opened us up. He talked a lot about Mayor de Blasio's upzoning. And I think the role of artists and the role of arts and culture has a complicated position in the role of community development. And in my day job, I embody a lot of that. So I know these issues well. And this morning I was reading, there's a really interesting thing that happened in Boyle Heights in California. And Boyle Heights is a neighborhood largely identified as Hispanic and Latino. An art gallery moved into it, and the neighborhoods kicked the art gallery out. And I think this is a really complicated situation for a lot of reasons. But as you think of sort of that notion of art-centric, arts-driven, the role of arts and culture in community planning and development, what's something that really excites you, San, and what's something that really gives you pause, that really you think we need to be very careful about?
I guess I'm thinking about Upham's Corner, which is a place where Art Place has invested and BAR's invested in a long time. One of the key driving partners there is a land trust, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. So I think one of the things that I really look at is that, there's two things. One is kind of artists really engaged in giving voice to community residents and just thinking about that process, not necessarily only as art making with a product at the end, but really that creative process of engaging people and helping them communicate a vision that they wouldn't have given voice to in a very deep kind of emotional way to city planners. So what do I mean by that? You know, there's a lot of creative, so the typical kind of community hearing in Boston is you go, you have 3 minutes, you're standing at a microphone, and you have a group of people like us sitting up here, and you just sort of tell them what is happening. And it's such an intimidating process. And what we've helped fund is artists doing creative processes where they're helping communities do cultural asset mapping, do blocks. They do, you know, some of the things that you've seen Candy Chang do in terms of blackboards out on the streets and just saying, you know, if you had $1 million, where would you allocate this money to? Street beautification projects. So I think that, you know, that sense of artistic process and creative process is super important in terms of not just thinking about the ultimate outcome. I think the second thing is that it's also that that it's not just arts in arts organizations, but it's actually arts programs of community-based programs that are really important. And so, so we've helped build the infrastructure around Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, around community development corporations, around financial agencies. So I think to look at it in multiple, where arts lives in multiple indigenous community organizations is the thing that we've been excited about. I think the big challenge has been how do we do something that Jamie's heard about is how do we have development without displacement? And so at the same time as we're thinking about helping to fund new venues and facilities coming in, how are we also thinking about the land trust mechanism that actually protects those spaces for the long term in terms of community ownership? So it's not just that space, but how do we look at the overall map of development that's happening and a master planning process for a whole neighborhood, not just a cultural plan? So I think this kind of integration into artist and cultural planning integration into master planning processes, land use processes, transportation process, and those kinds of other planning processes that the city's undertaking at this time is the important part for us in terms of artistic neighborhood development.
Well, and the neighborhood notion, Michelle, Chicago, at least my experience of the city of Chicago is that it's a city of neighborhoods, and that so many of those neighborhoods are identified by their arts asset, by their cultural assets. So whether it's the Ukrainian Easter Egg Museum, or it's amazing food, or it's amazing street music, or folk music, or the museums, or all of that. Has that always been perfect? Has that always gone exactly right? Or have there been moments in Chicago's development where the sort of arts and culture side of a neighborhood and the other sides of a neighborhood have been in conflict or been in misalignment?
Wow, I'm not sure how to answer that. Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, pretty defined by ethnicities. And so you'll find the neighborhoods really kind of reflect the culture of the residents. I think the tendency, though, in Chicago is, you know, it's not one size fits all. Here's an example of, you know, an art center was built in this neighborhood, and look at how it stimulated all this economic development. And resting on the shoulders of the arts, the responsibility of transformation for some of the more challenging communities that don't have the other stable ingredients in place. And so what worked in Lincoln Square in terms of, you know, the Old Town School of Folk Music stimulating a lot of community development and more economic investment, you know, probably can be more attributed to the fact that there were single-family homeowners in the neighborhood versus, you know, the work that an artist like Theaster Gates is doing in a really economically challenging community with no other investment happening, right? And so is the narrative then going to be, well, see, we tried it with, investing in an art space in a low-income community and nothing happened? Well, you didn't do anything else to support that.
Right.
So it's hard and it's challenging to look at the whole ecosystem that supports the arts in those neighborhoods beyond just, what's the magic recipe? And usually they all want to, well, it was the arts, whoa, the artist came in and made the neighborhood cool. Well, it wasn't just the artists. It was a lot of other support that made those things happen.
Now, Eddie, let me ask you sort of the flip of that. I mean, New York City is a city of neighborhood churn. Almost all of our neighborhoods are seeing profound change. And when I think about my friends in East New York and the fact the changes that East New York is going to see in the next 3 years are sort of mind-boggling. As we're thinking about sort of the upzoning, as we're thinking about the mayor's affordable housing plan, as we're thinking about neighborhood change, what should artists, what should arts organizations, what should the cultural community be doing? What is the proactive role that some of us should be taking in that change, in that planning, in helping to sort of join our neighbors in creating a future for us?
Well, this is actually really interesting because later on this week, University of Pennsylvania is putting out a study, the Social Impact of the Arts Project's putting out a study that looks at this issue of the correlation between, cultural assets being, artists, arts participants, nonprofit and for-profit cultural organizations, and other positive, social impacts, health, safety, education. One of the things that they have found is that nonprofits in general, this isn't just cultural organizations, nonprofits in general tend to have very strong vertical relationships. They have strong relationships to power sources. So it's the government, their donors, their funders, institutions, et cetera. But horizontal relationships, sort of the Gansevoort theory. The horizontal relationships are a real lost opportunity, especially when you're dealing in a moderate or a low-income neighborhood, because ultimately, when you're looking at a place that is ripe for change, it's your horizontal relationships through which you can do organizing, And so a couple of years ago, we took our capacity building program, which has historically just strengthened, individual organizations. That was our unit of intervention. And we wanted to increasingly work with other parts of the city government, right? To work with small business services and planning and housing preservation, et cetera. But they were increasingly taking, which is I think a good thing, sort of a spatial lens. They were looking at neighborhoods. So we said, well, look, a lot of these neighborhoods are becoming increasingly vulnerable because they're becoming hot, because, obviously, of the market. And we want the cultural organizations and the artists in there to actually benefit from this rather than to be displaced because of this. So we took the capacity building program, we said, all right, well, now it's going to focus on neighborhoods so that organizations are not only strengthened as individual organizations, but they're strengthened as a network, and they're connected to other stakeholders, so they're connected to the small business community and the libraries and the churches and et cetera, so that this way, when neighborhoods have to mobilize in the face of change, they're able to do so increasingly, one, with each other, but also with all of the cultural actors as an active participant in these processes with voice and agency.
Yeah, well, anyway, so that's coming out. The Stern and Seifert work is coming out this week. We'll be able to find Thursday. Yeah. We'll be able to find it. Let's sort of spring off that and spend a moment talking about cultural equity. And let's spend a moment talking about some of the issues related to sort of race and ethnicity and how those play out in the arts and culture space generally, and specifically in some of the nonprofit arts and cultural organizations. And Eddie, early in Mayor de Blasio's tenure, early in Commissioner Finkelpearl's tenure, you guys sort of picked this up as a major issue. Can you kick us off and just talk a little bit about why that was so important and what some of the things you've been thinking and doing since then have been?
Sure. I mean, I think that, I talked about a moment ago the fact that historically our interface has been organization by organization, as opposed to neighborhood by neighborhood or people by people, as in group of people. And we looked at this issue of diversity because we had kind of intuited that the cultural community just wasn't as diverse as the city. And to be fair, that's, I think, true of a lot of professional communities in
And when you
general.
say cultural community, are you talking about the nonprofit cultural community?
Yes,
Right.
yeah. Or it might be true of the for-profit. I don't think it's as true of the informal, and I don't think it's as true of individual artists. But and I think that's obviously simply a matter of structural inequities that trace the course of our history. With that said, I think that what we've found not only bears that out, but bears out nuances that I think it's incumbent upon us to address. And I think that you do see, for instance, people of color represented in the cultural community, people with disabilities, trans people, et cetera, but they're sort of bunched up at the bottom of organizational hierarchies, less so in the middle of organizational hierarchies. And therefore, it's not just a matter of creating on-ramps into the cultural community, which I think is worth doing, and we're working with CUNY towards that end, et cetera. But I think it's also incumbent upon us to invest in people in the cultural community where they are so they can advance within and between their organizations, because without doing that, we're basically creating an increased glut of people at the bottom of organizational hierarchies where they're lacking in decision-making power. And I think that that is a real opportunity for us to address right now.
San, let me ask you a slightly different take on this. My read, and you can correct me if any of this is wrong, but my read of sort of racial politics in Boston is that they're very black and white, and that if you are neither black nor white, your issues are often invisible in sort of the citywide conversation. And one of the things that Mayor Walsh has done is sort of said, if we're going to embrace the sort of notion of resiliency that the Rockefeller Foundation has introduced into us, that if we're going to be able to absorb shocks and respond to them in positive ways, one of the most important things we need to do is to create some racial healing, to create some racial connections, to begin to create that. Talk a little bit about how that has or hasn't played out in the cultural planning process, if you would.
So I think the one thing that I'll add to the perspective on Mayor Walsh is that recently he's also come out with a very strong statement about immigration, and also that the city should support immigration and should be a sanctuary city. So I think that's another really important piece of this kind of racial equity conversation, because I think often, especially in Boston, it's being cast as kind of a historic black-white paradigm because of a historic black community that's there, and that the Latino and Asian communities tend to be newer, and so really are then cast into like a new Bostonians immigration kind of false paradigm. So I think that's one thing, and so it's been interesting because I don't know that. So cultural equity came up as one of the 5 tenets of, or core areas of the cultural planning process. I think when we did that, it came from the community, but no one knew what it meant. Like, we had not gone through that process as a community of racial healing from segregation. We didn't go through a process of actually, I don't think we went through a process as a community of thinking about cultural competency, of shared language. So all of these things were taking place, and Boston is a place where we have a lot of historic Western European institutions that are doing incredible work. And so, so that piece about where there's so many different complications in it in terms of like where even our, it has been the historic funding for organizations of color in that. So I think coming out of the, sorry, I'm sort of rambling a little bit, but coming out of the cultural planning process, I think Barr Foundation and the Boston Foundation stepped up and said, where is that work taking place? And it was amongst individual artists, unincorporated companies, immigrant groups, and so we each created funding programs to try and really begin lifting up the practice that was happening in neighborhoods by individual artists. So So we've had some incredible, the Boston Foundation, along with BAR, just gave out 60 grants to individual artists and small companies for project-based work. The BAR Foundation's been supporting temporary public art projects that are community engagement that out of the 30 artists or groups, probably about 25 of them are artists of color. And so, so I think what's been happening is that we have a city process that's been talking about racial equity. We have historic institutions that are looking at how do we diversify our audiences. Then we have this effort that's about individual artists and giving voice to communities. So I think that piece, which is about how do we grow institutions of color in the middle, is the piece that is somewhat lacking right now, right? So I think that's one piece that I think we've not yet turned our attention in terms of how do we fund and support over the long term the growth of organizations of color. I think the second part is that we've not necessarily been clear about the difference between cultural equity and racial equity. So we have a gap between what the cultural plan is talking about in terms of cultural equity versus what the city's been looking at in terms of racial equity. And so how do we, and when you talked about where those tough choices and how do we prioritize, we've not necessarily had that conversation that brings those two things together. BAR's we're sort of like the silent partner that's trying to help things grease the wheels, I guess, in terms of some understanding at the city level, in terms of some cultural planning. So one of the things that we've looked at that we'll be supporting is actually having a cultural competency trainer come in to give training to funders, arts funders, to begin to build our language so that we can have a unified language and discussion forum so that we can begin responding and trying to be more proactive around this discussion of racial and cultural equity.
And let me just ask a quick question. For those of us who aren't as deeply steeped in the dialogue, when you're talking about cultural competency, can you just give a simple definition of what you mean by that?
Yeah, I would say that when we're looking at cultural competency, it's really about the kind of understanding of cultural dynamics and racial dynamics, and having that language to be able to identify, assess, address, and kind of treat people equally across knowing people. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
No,
what do you? Yeah, I mean.
Yeah,
I
no,
think
I just wanted to make sure that
basically,
folks
yeah.
were able to join that. Michelle, I was just at a group called the Funders Network, and one of the conversations that we were having was around the notion of compound interest. And if you have wealth, you get a lot more wealth, and you sort of keep growing your money. And so I'm going to get these statistics slightly wrong, but I think it would take something like 261 years for average African American wealth in this country to catch up to average white wealth. If we waited 261 years, it's not like white wealth would stop growing. So when you think about cultural organizations, older cultural organizations tended to be founded by white people who had money and had been growing their resources over 100 years, 150 years. Newer organizations, many of which are led by people who are not white, don't necessarily have that long trajectory and are trying to catch up. So when you think about an ecosystem of funding, when you think about public funding, when you think about private funding, how, if at all, should that notion of how long you've been around, how much money you already have, should that play into funding decisions? This is something all of us struggle with, and I've had this conversation at every place where I've ever worked. So I'm guessing you've spent, at some point in your career, spent some time talking about this.
I can't believe you're asking me that question. It's tough. Chicago is a pretty diverse city, and that dynamic is there. Institutions that might have 100-year, 75, 50-year legacy in place with donors that are able to sustain their operations up against new starts. I previously worked at the Joyce Foundation in Chicago, and it was very much committed to supporting, the language at that time was minority-run cultural organizations or community-based organizations. And so it was always that, rub about the culturally specific art group saying, we can't get the high wealth people of color to be on our boards because they're already sucked up by the Art Institute, the symphony, the large theater companies. And so it is a struggle, but I think one of the ways that some of them have been really creative about that is that, those people are kind of aging up, and there's another generation that nobody's really looking at right now, that they're cultivating that donor base to be the major, league donors of tomorrow today.
That's great. We want to get your voices to join us in conversation. I think we have some wireless microphones that are going to be coming around. So think about your questions. I'm going to ask one sort of lightning round, awful question to you guys to give you guys a chance to sort
Like
of
that
gather
last
your
one?
thoughts. Like that last one. Well, why would we have easy conversation, right? I mean, we've known each other. Why would we have the sort of "how are you doing" conversation?
That's what I get for not doing anything for you, right?
There's a really interesting libertarian economist called Tyler Cohen who's just come out with a book called The Complacent Class, which is worth reading. But when I was at the NEA, he came to us and he talked about sort of his notion of public subsidy is meant to incent behavior that wouldn't otherwise happen. And therefore, he believed that the creation of art should not receive subsidy because people will create art no matter what. If you were in the direst of circumstances, right? If you were in the Japanese American internment camps when the US decided to incarcerate part of our population 75 years ago, people created art. If you're in maximum security prisons, you create art. Is there any part of the art and cultural ecosystem that you think does not need subsidy? I'll start with Eddie and just go down.
That's not a tough question. No.
So everything is worth paying for.
Yes, I mean,
I want white people to see white art. That should be subsidized.
I think that, put it this way, I think that and I haven't read The Complacent Class, I'll be the first to admit.
And this isn't actually part of that. That's just,
Right,
I was
okay.
thinking about him because I was reading.
But ultimately, if you're talking about the public sector, the public sector, as you know, ultimately what you're investing in is the public good, right? Which includes everything from the creation of art to the presentation of art to the consumption, for lack of a better term, and the education about art. And while perhaps it could be argued that the creation of art would happen no matter what, that's not to say that there is any, that an infrastructure to support its enjoyment and integration into one's life just springs up around it. So considering how complex all of that is, I would argue that there are too many moving pieces in there to simply be passive in the face of it.
Michelle, water the entire ecosystem equally?
Well, I would just say I think that's been happening. I mean, when you look at the contributions of the public sector to arts in this country, it's been minuscule in comparison to Europe, right? Major support for the arts, but it hasn't stopped the tremendous output of creativity in America. I mean, if we were relying solely on funding from the NEA or our local art agencies, there wouldn't be much out there, but that's not the case. There's a tremendous amount of work that's happening. I think more than anything, public funding just kind of represents, the thumbs up seal of approval to help leverage additional funds, but it hasn't been, I don't think, kind of the end all of creative work happening in this country.
Sansan, anything that you think doesn't need subsidy to happen in the arts and cultural ecosystem that we should just let happen without any outside investment?
No, I mean, I agree with this. I mean, I think that my question tends to be, is there a bully pulpit that exists that government has that has not been used? So outside of the financial resources, are there other resources that actually should be brought to bear from government? So that's the only thing I would add to this.
And spoiler, just for the record, I also believe in public subsidy for every part of the arts ecosystem, including the creation of art. We have a voice right here that would love to join us. Do we have a microphone? Excellent. And if you would just say a word about who you are and welcome to join us in the conversation.
Yes, sorry about my cold. My name is Michael Mao, and I spent decades fighting Boston until I gave up. I think that the big problem with a lot of our cities, Boston being the worst of them all, is the reluctance to put money into building theaters in which dance could be reasonably presented. When the Opera House burned down, they never rebuilt it. They were too cheap. The Brahmins are very cheap. And their answer was to import stars of the Met in for a couple of weeks and put them in a barnyard called a war memorial. And that's that. And presumably they are supporting the Boston Ballet, but there was a theater that could have become a theater for dance, the Shakespeare Theater, after Peter Sellers destroyed the Shakespeare Repertory Company. They were out, and that could have become a theater for dance. But of course, the city wouldn't buy it. It was very cheap. It was only $400,000 at that point.
So let me...
One thing they're doing in Chicago, I mean, the city doesn't have the resources to construct new buildings, but as they divest of public buildings, schools, firehouses, police stations, they're making them available to nonprofits, including arts organizations, to take them over. I was just at an event last night for a children's theater company, the Children's Theater Company of Chicago, and they were celebrating their new home in a new old police station. Used to house, cells, and now it's a theater space filled with classrooms, spaces for performance, all designed to support children's theater in the city. And so there are a number of creative ways to think about how you can allow for more space for cultural work to happen. And I think this, Building for a Dollar program is just one
I
example.
think it's great. Sansan?
I mean, I think one of the, and I totally agree with you about the city, the city, unlike New York City or Chicago, actually doesn't own a lot of buildings. And so I think that's been a stressor on the arts community. So I think that the challenge now is can the city anticipate where new development will take place and begin investing in those areas and create new policy and zoning that would allow for those new buildings to take place. I think the other thing that we're looking at, or the city's looking at, is there partnership with developers that needs to happen, right? Because the developers are coming in with the resources, and can they bargain for the community benefit use? So I think this is the thing that I was saying, that if the city doesn't have money, particularly because Massachusetts doesn't want to tax people anymore and does not have leveraging ability or taxability in Boston, can it develop other kinds of bully pulpit kind of zoning incentive programs to make that happen?
And the piece that I would lift up in what Sansan said is, if the national conversation on infrastructure develops the way I think it's going to develop, community benefit agreements are probably going to be one of the most important policy interventions for the arts and cultural sector. So anyone who cares about these issues of space for the creation and consumption of art, I would encourage us all to sort of make sure we're doing our 101 homework. Up in the back, we have a voice.
Hi. First of all, thank you.
And I'm sorry, just say a word about who you are for the
Oh,
few
I'm
of us
sorry.
who don't
Joan
know.
Finkelstein, Harkness Foundation for Dance. Thank you to the panel. It's been really interesting to hear from two other large cities about how you've approached this, especially with the impending New York City Cultural Plan and the lessons we can learn from that. I was particularly intrigued, Michelle, by your description of how you submitted your Chicago Cultural Plan with its large goals and vision before actually having specific mechanisms for implementation and budget items per program in place. And so I'm wondering, in the New York City plan, Are you planning to have suggested mechanisms for implementation with attendant, budget estimates? Or are we shying away from budget estimates for fear that the plan will not be approved?
No, we want all the money, first of all. Second of all, no, we have budget conversations literally all the time with City Hall. I think if what you're talking about is sort of what Tom, our commissioner, mentioned this morning, the fact of the matter is that, our budget negotiations are kind of this constant ongoing process, and that's true of every public agency. So the published document probably won't come with line item budget proposals because, we have to go through a year of negotiation with City Hall around those. But money is probably the primary thing I talk about with City Hall.
And just to be clear, and I think I have this history right, it was the city council that sort of asked for the cultural planning process, and it is the city council that proposes and appropriates funds. So this is
through a
meant to be part of
negotiation,
that
yeah.
conversation between them and the administration. I think we have someone right down front, if we can bring a mic over here. Hi, and just say a word about who you are.
My name is Phyllis Lamhut. I'm a native New Yorker, and I have benefited a great deal by having real estate. Having been part of the Henry Street Playhouse and the company of Alvin Nicolai for over 20 years in my formative period. But if I'm not mistaken, perhaps Mr. Torres can help with this. I thought all my life I have heard, since let's say in the 40s all the way up, that it was the intention of builders to give dance companies or dancers space. On the west side of New York, we have on West End Avenue, where they built all these new high-rises, I thought there was supposed to be space for dance companies. So what I'm saying, what is the history of the rumor that all the high-end real estate hardly ever puts community space in for the arts? There's a history there of positive thinking and negative. They don't want to spend the money on that, or it may be detrimental to high-rise expensive apartments. I have no clue what that history is.
So, Eddie, you may not be able to do the whole history, but can you at least say a couple words about what is the current relationship when a private developer is developing something? How does he or she have to think about community space for the arts or otherwise?
Sure. Generally speaking, depending on what the space is, whether it's primarily residence or primarily business space, residences go through Housing Preservation and Development, business spaces usually go through Economic Development Corporation, and that's usually a negotiation that takes place with City Hall, with the community, et cetera, around whether there's a community use built into the space, and then either subsequent or parallel conversation as to what that community use would be. Usually the negotiations involve sort of your local elected representative, your city council member, et cetera, and sort of if we agree that there's a community use, then the negotiations become, is it a daycare center, is it, a public health facility, et cetera. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
I know what you're saying, but for years in the arts community, we hope that some of the builders would give us space, studio space. We're not asking for theaters or to have a school, and it has not really.
Yeah,
Well, and
I
I-
see what you're saying.
Yeah. And it almost never happens that we in the arts community have a dream that no one outside of it shares, right? This is something we're very good at, the sort of STEM to STEAM conversation, right? STEM is only STEAM in the arts and culture
But we've
conversation.
actually begun a task force between us and Economic Development Corporation and Housing Preservation Development towards that end because of this issue. We actually share that and want to increasingly make sure the other agencies are just as sort of energized around that too. So that's a point well taken.
And the city.
Also had an over 50-year career, so this has been going on for a very long time.
Well, and the city is also really smart about some of the deployments of restrictive covenants. So, for instance, when the city invested money in this space, with the previous organization, a restrictive covenant was put in space that kind of guaranteed it would be a dance use. So there's some good ways of doing that. We have a voice up here. Sorry, I don't mean to point. Hi.
Hi, my name is Michelle Camille-Bear. I work for the New York Community Trust, and thank you all for your comments today. It's been really wonderful to hear from you and to hear from other cities. I'm thinking a lot about what the post-plan context looks like, and comments around implementation are really of interest to me. I'm wondering what, other than funding, we should be thinking about, like accountability measures, groups on the ground that can help implement certain kinds of projects that can be a partner to the city. So what other kinds of implementation measures have been successful, least successful, would be dream measures in the plan?
Well, and Michelle, can I put you on the spot for a minute? Only because I think on the planning call, you were the one who talked about accountability, and you talked about the importance of holding people accountable.
Yeah, I think because it was such a inclusive process with the development of the plan, we wanted it to also be an inclusive process for the implementation. And so we reminded people that the cultural plan was not a strategic plan for the department. It is a plan for the city to think about how to realize, the 200 plus initiatives that were shared. And so it was how do we then empower artists, arts organizations, cultural organizations, and even those outside of the arts to get on board and support the plan. I think even though we only have, or the city of Chicago has allocated $1 million annually for the implementation of some of the initiatives, I think it really sparked the collaboration of funders in Chicago because there was such a groundswell of interest. And so priorities changed at foundations, and organizations got really smart about how to frame requests for funding that were aligned with the goals that were in the cultural plan. So that was one. The other thing in terms of accountability, when we hit the 1 year mark, we had an administration that was very big on announcements and reporting back, So we, did kind of the, it's been a year since the cultural plan was out, and here's what's been achieved. And it was, kind of this checklist of things. And then we quickly realized that that really wasn't the best way to measure success because many of these ideas should be ongoing. It's not like, oh, okay, arts education plan, check, we're done with arts education. No, we're not. We're not going to be done with arts education. So we moved away from, this idea of, okay, how many of the 200 initiatives have been achieved this year so far? And we can report that back, to just really trying to keep tabs on what are the ideas that people are gravitating towards. And does that seem to connect or reflect what the priorities are for communities in terms of what they want in the arts? Another thing that we did was we tried to identify an outside agency that would then be kind of the stewards of the plan, that it wasn't going to be the responsibility solely of the department. And so there's a statewide organization, the Arts Alliance of Illinois, that took on the charge of assembling a group of stakeholders to really kind of hold the department's feet to the fire about the plan, but also to kind of be the eyes of collecting the information and reports on what others were doing about the plan. And then they will release and have been releasing these kind of annual reports about the status of the plan. And it's not always complementary to the work of the department, but that's good. And I think it also lends more credibility to the process. And so we weren't afraid of somebody else reporting back on our progress or lack of progress about the plan. But again, it was having this kind of collective report and summary of what's happening citywide, and not just us reporting back to people about here's what we did or what we didn't do.
And let me ask Sansan, and then we'll end this question with Eddie. But
Just add
Sansan,
to this.
whose job is it to implement the Boston plan? Is it in someone's job description? Is it in several people's job descriptions? Who
Right.
sort of owns that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this is one of the big challenges that we had, was how do we move the plan from being a city-owned plan to being a community-owned plan. So I think what Michelle's talking about in terms of not just who's the accountability body, but who's actually the implementation body, and how do we create more leadership in the community as it takes going forward. I wanted to add like a couple of things. Sorry, did I answer that question? I wanted to add a couple of things to Michelle's thing, though. I think that one of the other things that we've been looking at is, are there political windows that open that can help put pressure on recommendations that come out of the plan again? And so where private sector or the community is saying, well, what did you do? Where is the city? And how do those moments for the community create other pressure points to get things done? I think the other thing that I said in the beginning that I'll reinforce here is that we needed to spread the ownership around, so we incorporated the arts plan, several key recommendations, into other planning processes, right? So it's in the massive land use plan, and those or in the transportation plan. And so those plans are actually much better resourced than the arts plan is, right? And the arts community is. So I think it's multiple places of accountability then.
And so, Eddie, let me just ask you very tactically, nuts and bolts. The plan that arrives on or about July 1st will be a series of recommendations to whom?
Yeah, that's actually very close to what you've said, and we're actually looking specifically at the Boston plan in terms of the delineation between what is city executed, what is city supported, and what's city spurred, for lack of a better term. I forget the exact language in the Boston plan. We are obviously the agency, in charge of developing the plan. I think certainly much of it will be on us to execute, but we're actually also working with the other agencies, one, because certain, plenty of stuff that happens in the city doesn't happen, on our steam, plenty of it happens in other agencies, but we also, just like you said, and this is why we brought in like Hester Street Collaborative, who largely work around sort of planning issues. They're not an arts organization. They largely work around the issues of community voice in other processes, because we want to make sure that there are cultural components in other agencies' plans, because again, they're just better resourced than we are. They are big and all-encompassing, and we know that ultimately we want more support to go to the cultural community. I don't need it to all go through this one agency.
That's great. All right, do we have one last big important thought? Can we give it to Nancy? Just because she's in my line of sight and I'm scared of her.
Nancy Humanoff, Mark Morris Dance Group. I just have a quick question for you, Eddie. You said you're looking at the Boston plan, but are there other plans that DCA has been looking at? And if so, what are they?
Oh yeah, I would say most major cities' plans we've looked at. So, Chicago's plan, Boston's plan. We actually really enjoyed Denver's plan. Also talking to...
enjoyed, I like that. It's a good verb when it comes to planning.
It was actually, it was actually a pleasure. Yeah, if you read it, it's a pleasure to read. And also talking to the different commissioners and staff who've executed those plans has been fantastic, because we've really learned a lot. I mean, one of the key takeaways that we learned from several cities, including you guys, was how important it is to decentralize the public engagement process, because there are so many colleagues who have such genuine and deep relationships with community members that we need to be able to resource without our having to suddenly create that out of whole cloth. And that's been a huge help to us.
That's great. So we've spent almost 75 minutes together in this space. As we're getting ready to leave ourselves in this configuration, what's one thing you want people to walk out of this conversation holding in their heads? What's one thing that you want to make sure that people sort of pay attention to as we leave this room? Sansan, we just start with you and we'll come straight down.
That sustainability strategy should really be the integration of arts into other sectors.
Thank you. Michelle?
Remind key leadership that the plan is important, that this integration of the cultural plan into other agencies only works when other commissioners understand and see that it's a top priority for the administration and they respond to that. So there are lots of ways to attack it.
That's great. Eddie?
And I would say, I would add something to that. I think that's exactly right. I would, whenever you guys, the public, deal with another agency asking about the cultural implications of whatever they're doing is hugely important. And likewise, checking in with us. Like I said, we want to become increasingly publicly engaged, and checking in with us and just saying, hey, remember you said you would do X, Y, and Z? You know, where's that stand?
That's great. So with that, I want to thank all of you for engaging in this conversation with us. I want to thank the interpreters who've been making sure that everyone can participate. And I want to thank Sansan, Michelle, and Eddie. Thank you so much.